The frost came early to the Hürtgen forest that winter, settling into the bones of the land like an uninvited guest. It was December 1944, and the trees stood bare as skeletons, their branches clawing at a sky the colour of old steel. Snow muffled the sounds of distant artillery, but not enough to hide the truth. The Americans were coming, and with them the thunder of something the Germans had begun to fear more than the tanks, more than the planes. The guns. In a clearing 3 kilometres behind the front lines, a group of Wehrmacht artillery officers stood in a semicircle around an object that did not belong to them. It rested on the frozen earth like a statement of intent, its barrel pointing skyward, its split trail carriage spread wide like the wings of some mechanical predator. The Americans called it the M101, though most German soldiers who survived an encounter with it simply called it der Hammer. The hammer. Hauptmann Friedrich Becker removed his gloves slowly, his breath forming small clouds in the cold air. 42 years old, a veteran of the Great War, and now this one, he had spent most of his military life around artillery. He knew the language of guns, the mathematics of death. He could tell you the effective range of a leichte Feldhaubitze 18 at maximum elevation. He could calculate windage corrections in his head while standing in a snowstorm. But the weapon before him was not supposed to be here, and its presence made him uneasy in ways he could not articulate. "Captured 3 days ago," said Oberleutnant Klaus Werner, gesturing toward the howitzer with a sheaf of papers. "Near Bergstein. The Americans abandoned it during a retreat. 4th Battery, probably. Intact, fully operational, and we recovered nearly 200 rounds of ammunition with it." Becker circled the gun slowly, his eyes taking in every detail. The carriage was lighter than the Leif-18, that much was obvious. The trails were simpler, lacking the ornate engineering that German doctrine demanded. The gun shield was thinner, the wheels smaller. Everything about it suggested a philosophy of construction that bordered on the crude. Yet there was something about its proportions, the way it sat balanced on its wheels, that suggested purpose over decoration. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. "They left it behind?" Becker asked, running his hand along the cold metal of the barrel. "Apparently," Werner replied. "Intel suggests they were overrun before they could disable it properly. We found drag marks. They tried to tow it out, but the ground was too soft. They cut the tow cables and withdrew on foot." Becker nodded, but his mind was elsewhere. The Americans did not abandon their guns lightly. He had read the intelligence reports, heard the stories from men who had survived the bombardments in Normandy. The American artillery was different. It did not simply shell positions, it erased them. Companies that had held ground for weeks would vanish in minutes under what the Americans called time-on-target barrages, hundreds of shells arriving simultaneously from different batteries, coordinated with a precision that seemed almost supernatural. "Have we tested it yet?" Becker asked. "We were waiting for you," Werner said. "Orders from division. They want a full evaluation. Range, accuracy, rate of fire, everything." Becker turned to the small group of enlisted men standing near a truck loaded with American ammunition. They were young, most of them replacements sent from training depots that no longer had time to train properly. They watched the howitzer with a mixture of curiosity and suspicion, as if it might explode simply from being examined. "Assemble a crew," Becker said quietly. "Let's see what the Americans built." The weapon had been designed, Becker knew, after the Great War. The Americans had studied captured German howitzers, including the very late FH-16 that had shattered Allied positions at Verdun and the Somme. They had taken those lessons and built their own doctrine around them. But where German engineering had evolved toward complexity, toward the pursuit of mechanical perfection, the Americans had chosen a different path. They had chosen simplicity, brutal, uncompromising simplicity. The crew approached the gun cautiously, as if it were a wild animal that might bite. Becker watched as they examined the breech mechanism, the recoil system, the sighting apparatus. He could see the confusion on their faces. Everything was wrong, from a German perspective. The breech was horizontal, not an interrupted screw. The recoil mechanism was mounted above and below the barrel, not exclusively above. The entire carriage seemed designed for speed of emplacement rather than stability of firing. "Sir," one of the gunners said, a corporal named Schmidt. "The ammunition, it's semi-fixed. The charge and projectile are separate, but they're in the same casing." Becker nodded. He had read about this in the intelligence summaries. The Americans used semi-fixed ammunition for their field guns, a compromise between the fixed rounds of smaller calibers and the separate loading system of heavy artillery. It allowed for faster loading than separate components, but maintained the flexibility to adjust charges for different ranges. "Load 1, Becker ordered. "Charge 3. The range is 1,500 meters." The crew moved with German efficiency, their training overcoming their unfamiliarity with the weapon. The round slid into the breech smoothly, and the block closed with a solid metallic click that spoke of American manufacturing precision. One of the loaders pulled the lanyard taut. "Ready," he called. Becker raised his hand, then dropped it. The gun fired. The sound was different from the LEF H-18, not louder, necessarily, but sharper, more focused. The recoil was violent, the entire carriage shifting backward despite the spades dug into the frozen earth. The barrel snapped back against the recoil mechanism with a speed that seemed almost aggressive, then returned to battery with mechanical certainty. Becker had closed his eyes at the moment of firing, a habit from his youth. Now he opened them and looked downrange. Smoke drifted across the test area, mixing with the falling snow. Through his binoculars, he could see the impact point, a dark crater in the white field. He calculated the distance mentally, compared it to the expected trajectory. "Again," he said quietly. "Charge 5 this time. Same bearing." They fired 3 more rounds, methodically working through the different charges, measuring the results. With each shot, Becker's unease grew. The weapon was accurate. Not just acceptable, but genuinely accurate. The dispersion pattern was tight, the range consistent, and the rate of fire was extraordinary. The crew, still learning the gun, was managing 4 rounds per minute. A trained American crew, he knew, could achieve 10 rounds per minute. The German LEF H-18 could manage 4 to 6 rounds per minute with a well-drilled crew. The Americans had built a weapon that could deliver nearly twice the volume of fire in the same period. Multiply that across a battery of 4 guns, multiply it across the 3 batteries that made up a battalion, multiply it across the 12 battalions in a typical American division. The mathematics were terrifying. "Hauptmann," Werner said, approaching with a clipboard, "I've been calculating the ammunition expenditure based on what we captured. The Americans had 30 rounds per gun stored with the battery. Division supply indicates that a typical American artillery battalion maintains over 8,000 rounds in reserve." Becker turned to him slowly. 8,000? Per battalion, sir. And they have 3 105mm battalions per division, plus 1 155mm battalion. The numbers hung in the cold air between them like an accusation. The Wehrmacht's artillery, by comparison, was chronically short of ammunition. German batteries were often restricted to 10 to 15 rounds per day in defensive positions, husbanding their limited stocks for emergencies. The Americans, it seemed, operated under no such constraints. "They treat ammunition like water," Werner continued. "Intelligence reports from Normandy indicate that American divisions fire more shells in a single day than some of our corps fire in a week." Becker walked back to the howitzer, placing his hand on the cold metal of the barrel. It was still warm from firing, the heat of combustion trapped in the steel. He thought of the American soldiers who had operated this gun, who had fed it shells until the moment they were forced to abandon it. He thought of the factories in Detroit and Pittsburgh, stamping out these weapons by the thousands. He thought of the ships bringing them across the Atlantic, of the supply chains that kept them fed with ammunition and spare parts. "Fire again," he said. "Maximum charge. Maximum range. The crew loaded a charge of 7 rounds, the powder bags visible through the cartridge casing. The lanyard pulled taut, the gun roared, and this time the recoil was savage, the spades tearing furrows in the frozen ground. The shells screamed away into the distance, arcing high into the winter sky before descending somewhere beyond the tree line, beyond the range of their observation. 11,000 meters, 7 miles, the Lehr FH-18, at maximum elevation with maximum charge, could reach 10,600 meters. The American gun had outranged it by nearly half a kilometer, and it had done so with a carriage that weighed 200 kilograms less. Der Teufel, muttered one of the loaders. The devil. Becker said nothing. He stood in the snow, watching smoke rise from the howitzer's muzzle, and felt the weight of understanding settle over him. This was not just a gun. This was a philosophy made manifest. The Americans had not tried to build the perfect artillery piece. They had built one that was good enough, but they had built thousands of them, and they had built the systems to feed them, maintain them, and deploy them with a speed that German logistics could not match. Sir, Werner said quietly, what should I put in the report? Becker turned to look at him, this young officer who still believed that superior German engineering would prevail, who still thought that the war could be won with better tanks and better tactics. He wanted to tell him the truth, that this weapon represented something more dangerous than firepower. It represented industrial capacity, organizational efficiency, and a willingness to accept practical solutions over theoretical perfection. But instead, he simply said, note that the weapon is functional and accurate. Recommend that captured pieces be distributed to units facing ammunition shortages. And note that the Americans appear to have solved the artillery war in ways we have not. Werner nodded, scribbling notes. Becker turned back to the howitzer, studying its lines one more time. Somewhere in the distance, the real American guns were firing, their shells falling on German positions with mathematical precision. And for every gun that fired, there were hundreds more being manufactured, shipped, and deployed. The snow fell harder now, beginning to cover the howitzer's barrel, dusting its carriage with white. It looked almost peaceful there, this American machine resting in German snow, but Becker knew better. It was a messenger, this gun, a warning written in steel and powder. They had laughed at American engineering once, dismissed their weapons as crude and their tactics as wasteful. They were not laughing anymore. As darkness fell over the forest, Becker gave the order to cover the howitzer and secure it for transport. They would conduct more tests, he knew. They would measure and calculate and document. But the conclusion was already clear in his mind, had been clear from the moment that the first shell had landed on target. The Americans had not just built a better gun, they had built a system, and systems, Becker understood, were far more dangerous than weapons. The frost deepened that night, and in the silence between artillery barrages, the captured howitzer sat like a monument to a truth that the Wehrmacht was only beginning to comprehend. Superior engineering meant nothing when your enemy could produce 10 weapons for every one of yours. Precision meant nothing when they could afford to fire 100 shells to your 10. Quality meant nothing when quantity arrived on a scale that made quality irrelevant. Becker stood at the window of the command post, watching snow fall on the dark shapes of German guns positioned in the trees. They were good guns, he thought. Perhaps better guns, in the abstract sense, but there were not enough of them, and there never would be. The mathematics had spoken. The Americans had won the artillery war not with genius, but with abundance. And in war, he realized, abundance was its own form of genius. The testing continued through the following week, each day revealing another layer of uncomfortable truth. Becker had assembled a team of 6 men, all experienced artillerists, all veterans of the Eastern Front, where they had learned to respect Soviet artillery's sheer volume of fire. Now they turned that experience toward understanding the American weapon, and what they discovered shook the foundations of everything they had been taught about proper artillery design. On the 3rd day, they conducted rapid-fire trials. The goal was simple: determine the maximum sustained rate of fire that the gun could maintain without overheating or mechanical failure. Becker had predicted 4 rounds per minute, perhaps 5 if the crew was exceptional. The LFH-18 could manage 6 rounds per minute for brief periods, but the heat build-up in the barrel and the stress on the recoil mechanism made sustained fire at that rate dangerous. The American gun changed those calculations entirely. "Ready," called Feldwebel Otto Hartmann, the gun captain Becker had selected to lead the crew. He was 38, a career soldier who had served with horse-drawn artillery in Poland and France before being retrained on mechanized guns. His hands moved across the breech with practiced efficiency, even on this unfamiliar weapon. "Fire for effect," Becker ordered. "Continue until I call a ceasefire." The first round erupted from the barrel at precisely 0900 hours. Hartmann's crew moved like a machine, the loader slamming shells into the breech, the gunner making minute adjustments, the ammunition handlers passing rounds forward in a continuous rhythm. The howitzer fired again. And again. And again. 10 seconds between rounds. Becker watched the stopwatch in his hand, counting the impacts downrange. At 1 minute, 6 shells had been fired. At 2 minutes, 12. The barrel was heating. He could see the air shimmering above it, but the recoil mechanism showed no signs of stress. The American hydraulic pneumatic system absorbed each shot with mechanical indifference, the barrel returning to battery with the same smooth motion every time. At 5 minutes, 30 rounds had been fired. The crew was sweating despite the cold, their breath coming in gasps, but the gun itself seemed tireless. Becker called the ceasefire, and the sudden silence was almost painful. "Inspect the weapon," he ordered. Hartmann and his crew examined the howitzer with careful hands, checking for cracks in the carriage, stress fractures in the trail assembly, wear on the recoil cylinder seals. They found nothing. The barrel was hot, yes, but not dangerously so. The breech mechanism operated as smoothly as it had at the first shot. Even the spades, which had been driven deep into the frozen ground by 30 consecutive recoils, showed no signs of damage or excessive wear. 6 rounds per minute sustained, Hartmann reported. The weapon could have continued. Werner scribbled notes furiously. "That's faster than our reported maximum rate for the LFH-18. "That's faster than our practical rate," Becker corrected. "Under combat conditions, with tired crews and limited ammunition, our guns average 3 rounds per minute. 4 if the crew is fresh and well-trained." He paused, looking at the American howitzer. This weapon could maintain 6 rounds per minute for hours, and a trained American crew could push it to 10. The implications were staggering. A single American battery of 4 guns could deliver 24 shells per minute sustained, 144 shells in 6 minutes. A German battery, by comparison, would fire perhaps 48 shells in the same period. The Americans could deliver 3 times the volume of fire with the same number of guns. "But surely the accuracy suffers," Werner protested. "At that rate of fire, the targeting must be compromised." "Test it," Becker said quietly. They spent the afternoon conducting accuracy trials, firing at marked targets at ranges from 1,000 to 10,000 meters. They varied the charges, adjusted for crosswinds, fired in different weather conditions. With each test, the results were the same. The dispersion pattern was tight, consistently tighter than the LFH-18 could achieve at comparable ranges. At 9,000 meters, with an HE-M1 shell, the probable error in range was 41 meters. The probable error in deflection was 10 meters. Becker compared these figures to the documented performance of German artillery. The American gun was not just as accurate as German pieces. It was more accurate, despite being lighter and simpler in construction. "How?" Werner asked, staring at the data. "The barrel is shorter, the carriage is lighter, the whole system seems designed for speed rather than precision. How is it more accurate?" Becker had been thinking about this question for days. Now, standing in the snow with the data sheets in his hand, he thought he understood. "Because they designed the entire system together," he said slowly. We build the gun first, then design the carriage to support it. We optimize each component separately and assume they will work together. The Americans designed the gun, the carriage, the recoil system, and the ammunition as a single integrated whole. Every part supports every other part. The result is greater than the sum of its components. He paused, watching smoke drift across the testing range. And because they do not demand perfection, they demand adequacy. Good enough is good enough, and good enough repeated 10,000 times is better than perfection repeated once. That night, Becker sat in his quarters writing the preliminary report. The kerosene lamp cast long shadows across the pages as he documented what they had learned. Range, superior. Rate of fire, superior. Accuracy, superior. Reliability, superior. Weight, inferior, but only marginally. And the reduction in weight was a feature, not a flaw, as it improved mobility. He paused, his pen hovering over the paper. There was one more test he wanted to conduct, one more question he needed answered. It was the question that had been growing in his mind since that first shot, the question that represented the true heart of the problem. How did this weapon perform in the hands of soldiers who were not German? The Wehrmacht prided itself on training, on discipline, on the superior quality of its soldiers. German artillery crews were among the best in the world, capable of complex calculations and precise fire control. But what happened when a weapon was so well designed that it did not require exceptional soldiers to operate it effectively? The next morning, Becker assembled a crew of replacements. Young men fresh from training depots, some with less than 6 weeks of artillery instruction. He gave them a 1-hour familiarization session with the American howitzer, explaining the basic operation, the loading procedure, the sighting system. Then he had them fire for effect. The results were shocking. These barely trained soldiers, operating an unfamiliar weapon, achieved a rate of fire of 4 rounds per minute with acceptable accuracy. Not exceptional, but acceptable, adequate, good enough. A German crew with similar training levels would have struggled to operate the Leopard-18 at all, let alone achieve effective fire. The Americans have democratized artillery, Becker said to Werner, as they watched the young replacements load another round. They have built a weapon that does not require years of training to operate. Any soldier with basic instruction can use it effectively. And because it is simple, it is reliable. And because it is reliable, commanders trust it. And because commanders trust it, they use it liberally. Werner was silent for a long moment. "We cannot match this," he said finally. "No," Becker agreed. "We cannot." The comprehensive report took 3 days to complete. Becker documented every test, every measurement, every observation. He included comparative data with the Leopard-18, the Leopard-18M with its muzzle brake, and even the newer Leopard-1840 mounted on the Pak-40 carriage. In every category that mattered, the American gun was equal or superior. But the numbers told only part of the story. The real revelation was in the philosophy behind the weapon. The Germans had designed their artillery to be operated by skilled professionals in a carefully controlled logistical system. The Americans had designed theirs to be operated by conscripts in a system of overwhelming abundance. When German guns fired, each shell was precious, carefully aimed, judiciously employed. When American guns fired, shells fell, in like rain. 1 out of every 5 shells fired by the Americans during this war is a 105mm HE round, Becker wrote in his summary. They have manufactured over 10,000 of these howitzers. They have standardized ammunition production across their entire military. A shell fired in the Pacific is identical to one fired in Europe. Their supply chains are optimized for volume, not variety. While we struggle to maintain stocks of ammunition for a dozen different gun types, they simply build more of the same thing. He paused, considering his next words carefully. This was the part of the report that would either be filed away and forgotten or would mark him as defeatist. But the truth demanded to be told. The strategic implications are clear, he continued. The Americans have solved the artillery problem not through superior technology, but through superior organization, they have accepted that good enough is sufficient when you can produce it in overwhelming quantities. They have recognized that a simple weapon that works reliably is more valuable than a complex weapon that works perfectly. And most importantly, they have built an industrial and logistical system that can deliver ammunition to their guns faster than we can deliver shells to ours. In head-to-head competition, a German Leif-18 battery might outperform an American M101 battery in terms of mechanical sophistication, but in actual combat, the American battery will fire 3 times as many shells, will do so with equal or greater accuracy, and will never run short of ammunition. The German battery will husband its limited stocks, will fire conservatively, and will eventually be silenced not by enemy action, but by supply failure. Recommendation: captured American artillery should be distributed to active units immediately. The ammunition we have captured will not last long, but it will provide temporary relief for units suffering from chronic ammunition shortages. More importantly, commanders must understand that we are not losing the artillery war because our guns are inferior. We are losing because we cannot feed them. Becker sealed the report and handed it to Werner for transmission to division headquarters. He did not expect it to change anything. The Wehrmacht's artillery doctrine was deeply embedded, its supply system too complex and fragmented to reform. The factories were being bombed, the railroads interdicted, the supply depots depleted. Even if they had wanted to adopt American methods, it was too late. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. 2 weeks after the final tests, Becker received word that his report had been read at corps level. There was interest, he was told, in conducting further evaluations of captured American equipment. There was also interest in his observations about American supply doctrine, but there were no orders to change German practices, no directive to simplify or standardize. The Wehrmacht would continue to fight with the tools it had, in the way it had always fought. The captured M101 was assigned to a unit near Aachen, where ammunition shortages had reduced some batteries to firing less than 5 rounds per day. The American shells would provide temporary relief, a brief respite before the inevitable return to scarcity. Becker heard later that the gun had been destroyed in an Allied airstrike before it could fire a single round in German hands. The irony was not lost on him, but the weapon had already done its work. It had delivered its message, not in shells but in understanding. The war was not being won or lost on the basis of which army had the better tanks or the better tactics or the better soldiers. It was being won by logistics, by industry, by the ability to deliver overwhelming material superiority to the point of contact. The Germans had built beautiful guns, precise guns, guns that represented the pinnacle of mechanical engineering. The Americans had built adequate guns, simple guns, guns that could be manufactured by the thousands and fed by a supply system that treated ammunition as an unlimited resource. In the mathematics of industrial warfare, adequate times 10,000 beat perfect times 1,000. Becker remained at the testing facility through January 1945, evaluating other captured equipment as it became available. A Sherman tank with a 105mm Howitzer mounted in its turret, a self-propelled gun the Americans called the Priest, with an M2 howitzer on a Sherman chassis. Each piece of equipment told the same story. The Americans had standardized, simplified, and mass-produced their way to superiority. In February, the facility was evacuated as Allied forces advanced. Becker loaded his reports into a truck and drove west, joining the flood of refugees and soldiers retreating toward the Rhine. Somewhere behind him, the Americans were bringing up their artillery, those simple, reliable, infinitely abundant guns that would pound German positions into submission not with superior technology, but with superior numbers. He thought of the young American soldiers who had abandoned that first M101 in the mud near Bergstein. They had probably cursed the gun as they cut it loose, frustrated at leaving equipment behind. But they did not need to worry. There would be another gun waiting for them, and another after that, and unlimited shells to feed them all. The loss of one howitzer meant nothing in a system designed for abundance. The German artillery would fight on, of course. Crews would continue to operate their guns with skill and precision, making every shell count. But they were fighting a different war than their enemies. A war where scarcity was the enemy and conservation was survival. The Americans fought a war of abundance, where ammunition was cheap and caution was expensive. By March, Becker had reached a collection point for artillery officers near Bonn. The facility was chaotic, filled with men separated from their units, equipment without crews, orders without meaning. He reported to a major who looked at him with tired eyes and asked what unit he had been with. Artillery testing facility. Hürtgen, Becker replied. I was evaluating captured equipment. The major nodded absently. We need every gun we can get. Are you qualified to command a battery? Yes, sir. Good. We have a battery of mixed pieces. 2 Lehr FH-18, 1 French 155, and 1 captured American 105. Can you work with that? Becker felt a strange satisfaction. Yes, sir. I know American guns well. Outstanding. You'll take position west of the river. Limited ammunition, so make it count. The Americans are bringing up their artillery and should be in range by tomorrow. Becker nodded, gathering his equipment. As he walked toward his new command, he thought about the irony of the situation. He would command a German battery that included the very weapon he had tested, firing back at the Americans who had built it. He would face their massed batteries with his makeshift collection of guns, rationing his shells while they fired without restraint. The mathematics were clear. His battery would fire perhaps 50 rounds before running out of ammunition. The American batteries opposite him would fire thousands, but he would fire those 50 rounds with skill and precision, making each one count, and perhaps that would be enough to delay them for a few hours, to exact a small price for their advance. It would not change the outcome. Nothing could change the outcome now, but it was what artillery officers did. They calculated ranges and adjusted for wind, and made the guns speak with whatever shells they had. The fact that the enemy had more guns and more shells did not change the duty. As night fell over the Rhine, Becker supervised the positioning of his guns. The 2 Lehr FH-18 were placed on the flanks, the French piece in the centre, and the American M101 on the right. He detailed a crew for each gun, distributing his limited ammunition carefully. 60 rounds for the German guns, 40 for the French, and 35 for the American. He ran his hand along the barrel of the M101, this weapon he had come to know so well. It was strange, he thought, to be preparing to fire it against its makers. But then, everything about this war was strange now. Guns firing at their builders, soldiers defending ground they knew was lost, officers giving orders they knew were futile. Sir, said Hartmann, who had been assigned to his battery along with 2 men from the original testing crew. The American gun. Should we conserve ammunition or fire for effect? Becker considered the question. The German doctrine was clear. Conserve ammunition. Fire only when targets are certain. Make every shell count. But he had learned something from studying the American weapon, something about the value of volume over precision. Fire for effect, he said quietly. The Americans taught us that lesson, whether they meant to or not. When you have 35 rounds, you can fire 35 rounds. When they have 35,000, they fire 35,000. We cannot match their abundance, but we can honor their philosophy. Shoot while you have ammunition to shoot. Hartmann nodded, a small smile crossing his weathered face. Understood, sir. The American artillery opened fire at dawn, just as the major had predicted. The sound was like thunder rolling across the river, continuous and overwhelming. Shells began falling on the German positions with mechanical precision, time-on-target barrages that arrived with dozens of impacts simultaneously. Becker had read about this capability and had seen the calculations in intelligence reports. Now he experienced it directly, the earth shaking beneath his feet, the air filled with smoke and screaming steel. His battery returned fire, each gun speaking in turn. The WWII fired their precise, carefully aimed rounds. The French gun added its voice, its shells older but still deadly, and the M101 spoke with its characteristic sharp report. Shells leaving the barrel at the rate Becker had documented in his tests, 6 rounds per minute, the crew moving with practiced efficiency even as American shells fell around them. For 20 minutes, they maintained fire, hurling their limited stock of ammunition at the advancing Americans. Becker knew they were achieving hits, knew their shots were finding targets, but he also knew it did not matter. For every round his battery fired, the Americans returned 10. For every gun he commanded, they had 5. The mathematics were inescapable. The end came suddenly. An American shell landed directly on the French gun, silencing it instantly. Then one of the WWII took a direct hit, the entire carriage lifting into the air before crashing back to earth in a twisted wreck. Becker ordered the surviving guns to withdraw. But before they could move, another barrage arrived, this one heavier than the last. The M101 took a hit in its shield, shrapnel tearing through the metal. Hartmann went down, blood streaming from his leg. The surviving crew members dragged him away from the gun, leaving it silent and damaged, pointing uselessly at the sky. Becker watched from his position as the last WWII fired its remaining rounds, the crew working mechanically even as shells fell around them. When the ammunition was exhausted, they spiked the breach and withdrew, carrying their wounded with them. In the space of 30 minutes, his battery had ceased to exist as an effective force. He took one last look at the M101, this American gun that had travelled so far to end up here, damaged and silent on a German riverbank. It had fired perhaps 20 of its 35 rounds before being hit. The remaining ammunition lay scattered around it, useless now, testament to what might have been. As he withdrew with the survivors of his battery, Becker could hear the American guns still firing, their shells falling with mechanical regularity on positions that were already abandoned. They would fire hundreds more rounds before discovering that the Germans had withdrawn. They could afford to. That was the lesson. They could afford to waste ammunition, to fire without perfect certainty, to overwhelm rather than outthink. The war ended for Becker in April, when his unit was cut off and forced to surrender near Remagen. He spent 3 months in a prisoner of war camp, sleeping in tents and eating American rations. The food was abundant, he noted with bitter irony. Even their prisoners ate better than German soldiers in the field. After his release, he returned to a Germany that no longer existed, to cities that were rubble and a nation that was occupied. He found work eventually, not in the military but in industry, helping to rebuild factories that would produce civilian goods instead of weapons. Sometimes he thought about the artillery war, about the guns he had tested and the reports he had written. In the 1950s, he read that some of the captured American howitzers had been refurbished by German industry and adopted into the Bundeswehr, the new German military. The Feldhaubitze 105mm M1A2, they called it, a Rheinmetall modified version with a longer barrel and a muzzle brake. The irony was complete. The Germans had studied the American gun, learned its lessons, and finally adopted its philosophy of adequacy over perfection. Becker lived to see artillery evolve beyond the guns of his youth, to see self-propelled howitzers and rocket artillery and precision-guided munitions. But the fundamental lesson remained unchanged. In industrial warfare, abundance mattered more than excellence. Systems mattered more than individual weapons, and the ability to deliver overwhelming firepower to the point of contact mattered more than any amount of tactical genius. The M101 itself remained in service around the world for decades, outliving the war that had produced it, outliving the soldiers who had designed and operated it. It fought in Korea and Vietnam, in Middle Eastern conflicts and African wars. Over 60 countries eventually operated the weapon, and many still did at the dawn of the 21st century. Its simplicity was its strength, its adequacy, its genius. In American museums, preserved examples of the M101 sit beside the tanks and aircraft of the Second World War, monuments to a generation that had learned to wage industrial warfare on a scale never before seen. The plaques describe their range and rate of fire, their deployment and tactical role. But they cannot capture the deeper truth, the lesson that Becker had learned in that frozen forest in December 1944. The Americans had not won the artillery war with superior guns. They had won it with superior thinking. They had recognized that modern war was not a contest between individual weapons but between systems, between philosophies of production and deployment. They had chosen abundance over scarcity, adequacy over perfection, and in doing so, they had created a military doctrine that shaped warfare for generations to come. The howitzer that Becker had tested, that specific gun captured near Bergstein, was probably destroyed in the war's final weeks, reduced to scrap metal and fading memories. But its legacy lived on in every American military operation that followed, in every conflict where firepower and logistics determined the outcome. The philosophy it represented became doctrine, and the doctrine became reality. In the end, that was the greatest weapon of all. Not the gun itself, but the thinking behind it. The recognition that wars are won by nations, not armies, and that national strength is measured not in the quality of individual weapons, but in the capacity to produce, supply, and sustain them in overwhelming numbers. Becker died in 1978, an old man in a country that bore little resemblance to the one he had known in his youth. His reports from the testing facility survived in archives, occasionally cited by military historians studying the evolution of artillery doctrine. Few readers understood their full significance. They were numbers and measurements, technical evaluations of captured equipment. But for those who knew where to look, they were something more. They were the final confession of a defeated army, the acknowledgement that they had lost not because their weapons were inferior, but because their philosophy was obsolete. The American 105mm Howitzer had been good enough, and good enough, multiplied by 10,000 and sustained by unlimited ammunition, had been more than sufficient to win. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.